Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of 30 Minutes with the Modern Mystic. I'm Sascha, and this is Michael. Where do we begin, Michael? It's Aliens 2.
Aliens 2. Well, in the movies, there was this horrible creature. Okay, Aliens 2, I think we should begin with realizing that I've never, ever had a physical encounter with an alien. You take note, Sascha, I have never had a physical encounter with an alien, but I have had many metaphysical encounters with, which I don't like to call aliens, with other beings in other dimensions. And I have to say, with the one exception of the grey, they were all of a considerably higher consciousness than I am.
So you did have a metaphysical encounter with the grey?
Of course, I might have known you'd pick on that one. Yes, I did have a metaphysical encounter with the grey. Have to be scratching my memory to go back into some of these. But I had a metaphysical encounter with a grey, and a small group of them spotted me, and I wasn't sure what to do because they saw me metaphysically, which I didn't expect at all. And so I started feeling just deep love for myself. And that was at a stage when I was sending it to them, whereas now I'm so deeply embedded in there's nothing outside of self. So all you have to do is feel love. You don't have to send it anywhere. And anyway, that they dispersed, they disappeared by me sending love toward them. They didn't like it.
What was the situation that you encountered them?
Now, that's what I don't remember, but I think it was when I was in one of my times when I was looking at the planet in the past, and it's a long time ago this happened, and I think it might have been, no, I don't know, I'll be guessing, but it's a long time ago.
It's interesting, though, that you say they are of a lower, and it's interesting, though, that that you say they are of a lower frequency, but yet they were able to see you metaphysically.
That intrigues me, and I really can't explain that. They're of a low consciousness, but a low consciousness does not mean not clever. Some of the very cleverest people have a low consciousness, and but they were definitely far more conversant on the traveling, energetic traveling than I was at that time. But you're asking me to look back 30 years, and definitely Michael dominated, and I really don't remember much more about it. And I know because you love me, you're going to move on.
How about reptilians? I know we talked about reptilians last time. So did you have metaphysical encounters with reptilians?
I was an onlooker. I didn't have any encounter. Note my words earlier. I have never had an encounter.
A physical encounter, you said.
Okay, well, even the reptilian encounter I had, I was definitely an onlooker, and I was aware, as like an onlooker or spectator. I was being shown that there were three distinct, very much higher consciousness reptilians who were benign and had no evil intent with us at all. A middle level where they were basically ignored us and had nothing to do with us. And then a serious, much more lower level, and the warrior class was on the lower level, where it is inclined to be, but maybe I should withdraw that comment. There were warrior class on the mid level, but they were not involved with us in any way. It was definitely the lower level of consciousness that was still involved with the cabal more than with humanity.
Did those three levels look the same, or did they have distinct different appearances?
The differences were the differences of more refined, more normal, and then definitely heavier, coarser bodies and a really heavy energy at the lower level.
Okay, so let's move on maybe to the next species that you've encountered metaphysically.
metaphysically, I've met up. I was once, there's a feline species, and the representative for me, I had named himself Seine, Seine, Seine. And when I asked him more recently for the name of the species, he smiled and just said, refer to us as the Seines. So whether that means there are anything or not, I don't know. But they are definitely a beautiful, and I say that meaningfully, they're a beautiful looking species with very, very short fur all over them. And they have interesting eyes, in as much as the eyes seem to have a second eyelid that rolls over it and opens up. Looking into the eyes of Seine is like looking into, a bit like looking into the universe. Again, I haven't seen Seine in quite a while, and I'm writing in a book at the moment, but eventually I plan to do a trip to revisit these other beings I've met in other realities. I would sort of like to revisit them as a slightly more matured and slightly more aware or more conscious being than I was when I first encountered them. For instance, there was a being I called the Wonder Neep, and I was definitely in a past, way back in the past. And the Wonder Neep was like a little bubble. I say little, twice as big as a football maybe, as my memory serves me correctly. And in it was a little creature. I have reoccurring dreams of this, and always in my reoccurring dreams, I'm, as you know, I keep having to take a step back. I'm a plant enthusiast. And there was a time when I had a collection of insectivorous plants. They're not carnivorous, they're insectivorous. And but carnivorous is much more glamorous. And so they're insectivorous. And then I used to dream about having an insectivorous plant in a jar of water. Now, the simple fact is, physically, I've never had that, but I suspect that when I was in some incarnation, when I was not human, you see, we don't always incarnate human, depending on our consciousness. If your consciousness is raising, we often incarnate in a non-human, on a non-human level. And for once, for instance, I incarnated into a place where I was a flying species and not a bird, but an animal that flew, with a big shaggy sort of furry animal that had a membrane between arms and feet. Okay, I never did tell you about this. And they would jump off cliffs and they were almost weightless and just soar for hours and hours and hours. And there was an enormous healing in this, an incredible healing and a state of inner peace and calmness. And they were very short incarnations, but they didn't come to tragic ends. It seemed, I didn't see the end of this, but it seems like when you've reached a certain stage and you say, okay, this was wonderful, now I'm going back, and you simply left it and went back. Okay, I'm getting further and further away, but in all this, I began to have a lot of, I'm still getting them, dreams, probably 4 or 5, 6 a year, where I have this, I find this incredible plant in the stream, and I put it into a jar and it moves, and I treasure it so deeply. And when the Wonder Neep represents that, or that represents the Wonder Neep, that would be more accurate to say. So the Wonder Neep is very much like this plant I dream about, except it's sentient, it's highly intelligent, it doesn't have emotions particularly, but there is compassion. And so it makes me sort of think that compassion is like love. Love is not an emotion. And I feel that compassion, although we will call it an emotion, I think for many higher beings, it's not an emotion. Our emotions are beyond any beings I've ever encountered. They're very important to us in our development. And so the Wandani cared for me for a while. It was my guide and carer. And I would like to visit that again one day. And there are beings when I was in, which I think are pretty much in the, into a timeless realm. I met so many beings there, I'm almost jumbled up with them.
Were these encounters mostly casual encounters, or was it something that you were looking for and then how?
Do you know, well, let's define casual. I think metaphysically nothing is casual. There always seems to be a purpose, even if I don't know what that purpose is. But equally, casual is a good word to use when you're in a metaphysical experience. Often the encounters appear casual. For instance, when I was, when I met many of the so-called gods and goddesses, with that great purple gate that opened up, I think there, they were trying to make me get away from being the tiny kindergarten student with these great higher beings. They were trying to move me away from that to owning my greatness, which eventually I did, but I had a struggle with it in those times. Then when I was in the flying, when I was in that, that metaphysical alien, if you like, aircraft, where every time I walked into a room, I seemed to be in their reality. And so it's a bit like a Doctor Who machine. You know, it just seemed to be infinite. But when I went in there, one of my, see, this was, you'd say, is this casual? One of my favorite plants is the Australian grass tree, which is a xanthorrhea. Now, the xanthorrhea, I don't know why, I just love the plant. It has a long stem and it grows up with this glass-like top to it. Very, very long-lived, very, very slow growing. There are probably some in Australia that are 1,000 years old. And the ones in where I live is Xanthorrhea johnstonii. And I just like them. I've got a lot in my garden. I've even got some wild ones in the garden, in the New Forest garden, which I really like. So they are something in me, in sort of, I've taken within me. So one of the rooms I walk into, it's like a desert. And I walk into it and a being comes toward me, which looks like a moving Australian grass tree, except all the tendrils, the long stems, are all moving. They're all animated, and this one communicates with me. But again, that is so long ago, over 30 years ago, I don't remember much of that. I could reread those books and re-empower my mind, but I really want to come to a point where I re-encounter them, that I basically set out to meet them all again.
I think this brings up an interesting question regarding metaphysical experiences and travel. How much of what we see and experience in those metaphysical travels, in our exercises and whatever we do metaphysically, how much would you say is actually really the way that we experience it in terms of how it looks, and how much of it is basically adjusted to our own world and perception and our own conditioning and everything?
That's a very good question. I have absolutely no doubt that the whole nature spirit kingdom is deeply based in our imprints of what a fairy looks like, what elves look like. And, you know, these are other beings. And I know an elf who looked like an elf showed me that he could become a faun, F-A-U-N, and then he became a dot of light, a speck of light. And he said, this is easy for me. What do you want? I said, elf, please, because I could relate to it. And when I first encountered Pam, Pam was a being, you know, well, 6'2" or 3, beautiful, beautiful body with a head that was human, but with little horns and a very challenging head, because the beauty of it was off-world. You know, it's like energetically, you couldn't take the energy away from the form. And of course, it was metaphysical, but he very quick, as he said to me, this is not real. This is, I've just created this for you to ease you into this process.
Yeah, this makes, yeah.
He long ago took it away.
This whole discussion makes me wonder about the purpose of forms in general. And I mean, if we look at ourselves as a human species and we look at others, it's all based not so much on vibration or our energetic sensations. It's very much based on appearance, on forms that we either see with our physical eyes or we might experience metaphysically, but it's still forms that we perceive. So I'm wondering, how much of a role does in general, like forms of beings or of energies have in the whole creation? Or is it just something that we as beings who incarnate into a physical realm, because we are used to see through physical eyes, so everything like this mug has a shape, you have a shape, and I can recognize you through this shape. Is it just something, maybe this whole form thing, that is because we are in this physical realm through our eyes, you know, maybe in the end it's all just energy and there's no real form, and there's just a vibration?
I have a question for you. Did you do a brain swap with an alien? Okay, probably not. Okay. Okay. Form and identity go hand in hand. You know, a masked ball, you just blank out your eyes. And okay, you probably know who they are, but and the masked ball where you cover from here to about here, that hides the identity pretty effectively, unlike the masks we wear. And yet that cuts down communication. So the current masks are designed definitely to curtail or limit conversation. Whereas the mask, so form and identity go together very, very much so. And it was at a coincidence that this being looked like the grass plant, which I really am very endeared to. And this thing that I keep dreaming of, that is like an insectivorous plant that moves in a jar, in a bottle that I put it in. And the wonder leaf, which really touched me very deeply, the wonder leaf. And so yes, I think there is a definite connection, because we have a world of illusion. And a metaphysical being, like you and I, a magnificent metaphysical being, is actually formless, because we can extend that out, or we can bring it down to the size of a flame, of a candle. And so we do not actually have a form. But like in the fifth chamber, there's an androgynous figure of the human, which is only about, which is tiny, microscopic, but it gives us something to identify with. And
so would you say though
that is the seed of ascension, but it's not saying, you know, they'd call it the God atom because God made us in his name. And I don't jump to that conclusion at all. But the answer to what you're saying is yes, there's a big connection.
Would you say that it's unique to us as humans to relate to everything and any other being through this perception of a form of a sentient being, and that maybe highly evolved beings who are maybe just formless do not relate to everything else in the creation through this lens of shapes and forms?
I think it's a very limited form of perception, and I think that it perfectly suits us in our stage of the evolution of consciousness, and that we will eventually transcend that. And it's not just some and others won't. Everyone will, but some will take longer to do that than others.
Have you ever heard of the law of one?
The what?
The law of one.
I've heard the power of one. It's
Now,
a
the
good
law of
book.
one is material compiled over many years by a couple of researchers who got in touch with, let's just say, an alien. Let's just leave it at that. An alien back in the, I think it started back in the 70s or 80s,
No, I've
and
never heard of it.
it's very it goes very deep, and it seems to, I've read and seen a lot of material, but this one is my most favorite material, and it goes very deep. And those beings speak of, they say, I think that they're from the 8th dimension, and they say that they have moved beyond individual.
Yeah, I
What's
get
the,
it.
so they have moved on to something where they are
A
both,
collective.
where they are a collective energy. They are a species as one collective, but also individually, and everybody shares every experience they've ever had. And they, at some point, they say something along the lines of, at one point in our evolution, everybody was so spiritually evolved that we could merge into one without losing our individual accentuations. Yes. But well, so that touches that topic. I find that very intriguing.
That is the one in all, the all in one. And that's where they reached.
They say a social, the word they use is we are a social, because the guy asks, who are you? So the guy, the energy or the alien that they communicate with calls itself Ra, and it says, we are a social memory complex. That's the way they refer to themselves.
That's nicely put. I've heard of Ra. Do you have this in English?
Yeah, sure. It's freely available on the internet, and it's the best material that I know of.
The first law.
Well, the law of one, the raw material, it goes by those two names. I can send it to you, but
send me a link. Thank you. I'll definitely be interested. Yes, so there are many. There are the one that was known as I can't think of his name. There are collectives that communicate with particular channels, generally trance channels, so they take their personality identity out of it.
That's the way it works. Yep. Mm-hmm.
They can receive a much higher level. I have no question of doubt in my mind whatsoever. A lot of people say, "Oh, we're low," but that question is like a joke these days. But sometimes it can be a very humbling experience when you travel metaphysically and you meet. I haven't met anything of that level, or I'm not aware of having met it, but I am aware that I've been guided in many of my earlier metaphysical journeys. I was very aware that I've been guided. I wouldn't say maneuvered and manipulated, but I was being guided and sort of steered in certain directions for my benefit, rather than blunder around like a kid in a china shop.
Now, something else that I find very intriguing, and we have a couple more minutes, I think, is the topic of craft in general, when we talk about aliens. So we have this whole UFO thing, people seeing UFOs all over for the past 70 years and older. We have this old Indian craft that was described in the Vedic literature. And so crafts and aliens have been associated forever. And you just spoke about a craft that you entered. I also imagine that at some point evolution, they don't need, or species don't need any craft. What do you think?
This was not a craft that was needed. It was like a traveling home, for many beings lived in it, and they went in through their door, and they were in a frame of reality, which was basically home. And it's sort of very difficult to comprehend that level of reality, where the craft was reasonably small, but it seemed to contain, for all the beings that were in there, and there were 20 or 30, it's like their home was with them. It was like endless, like there was no end.
Do you know do you know what their purpose was in traveling around in that craft?
I don't know their purpose. I mean, for instance, the pilot, if there was such a thing, of the craft, looked like a python, a massive python, almost an anaconda, with two with a head like the two of them, and they had like a head like a dustbin lid. And, that's a bit of a shock for me. I'm looking at something like an anaconda with a head like a dustbin lid. And when you learn that that is so far beyond your own sort of intelligence and consciousness, it's very, very humbling. You're just trying to catch up. You're trying not to feel like a complete idiot. You want to raise your thoughts, oh my God, a snake with a dustbin for a head, which you're thinking. And yeah, it's embarrassing, quite honestly. It's embarrassing.
Did they notice you?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I was quite like an honored guest.
And what was the communication between you and them? How did they?
The communication was about the changes that would be sweeping our planet. It was being well in my lifetime. I had a role to play in that, and these changes would sweep the planet, and there would be like a new beginning. And they didn't say an old continuation, it would be a new beginning. And I think for those who are ready, that's probably what it will be.
Do you know anything of something like a galactic federation of benign beings who overlook the cosmos and everything?
Quite honestly, although I didn't meet anyone who said we are the Galactic Federation, a few years later, I felt that's what it was. A federation of beings who, was there a hierarchy? Yes, there was, but it was only a hierarchy of consciousness. There was no pecking order. So when we think of hierarchy, we have boss and then down. This was a hierarchy in consciousness, but there was nothing like that at all as regards higher and lower.
Were humans represented in that federation?
Sorry?
Were humans represented in that federation?
Yes, yes. But they weren't humans from our place that I saw. They may have been fifth dimensional humans.
When you say fifth dimensional humans, you're speaking of just more evolved humans, human beings?
Yes, yeah. I'm just talking of us in a slightly more evolved stage. Quite honestly, with some of our hang-ups, I don't feel anywhere near qualified to represent humanity.
Do you have any insight or memory of what they were actually doing? So you see, they're overlooking. They have an idea of what is.
They swept over the planet Earth and they released what I saw as sparkles of light. And they released it, and the sparkles of light. Later, I was to see like curtains of light and sparkles of light sweeping across the planet. But that was years later. They're still there, moving around, and but they're metaphysical. They're not seen by. I don't see them now unless I start to come out metaphysically, and then I see them.
Now, I remember last session we talked about free will intervention. I'm wondering, when is the line of intervention towards, okay, we are infringing upon free will crossed, and when it's just something like an uplifting inspiration, like, okay, got a little bit of light here.
I think intervention is like, okay, we need to save them from themselves because we can't be lost. And so we can't be lost. We can be lost in our own beliefs, in our own illusions, but we can't be lost permanently.
Because interestingly, in the law of one, they say the primary law of the cosmos is the law of one, and then out of this comes the law of love, and then one step below is the law of free will. So if you violate any of these three, basically you create karma.
They put free will below love.
Yeah, they say that free will comes out of love.
I agree. I'm astonished to hear this because I've never had that presented to me. So once you have unconditional love, your will is already given. It's given to love, and you become a conduit for love. And you know, people say, why don't I, as a spiritual teacher, play low key? I'm sorry, but this is the way I am. This is me expressing love. And the idea, I think if I didn't, I would probably die, because I would be, you know, this is you don't say to a carrot, I want you to grow into a parsnip, to a carrot seed. A human, when that seed flowers, it begins to express its fragrance of truth, then it expresses in a way that is unique to every person. So I really agree with that. Free will is where you have choices. And when unconditional love takes you, but you've given yourself to it, those choices are gone.
Also, before we close this session, another thing that I found very intriguing was that basically they said that they cannot work against the law of free will. So that's why they cannot directly intervene. And they said, so this raw species, they said, we did this in the past, and they mentioned Egypt, for example. They said they were the ones involved with building the pyramids as an instrument of a tool of initiation, spiritual initiation. And they said every attempt they did to intervene with humanity positively failed and caused a lot of karma for them. So they have a karmic connection with humanity.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, you cannot interfere with free will. Otherwise, it's not free will. Angels on a line of evolution of God's will, as it were, divine will. We have free will, and we haven't yet reached the ascendancy of unconditional love. That is new. You can't have subconscious love. There's no such thing. You could think you have it, but that doesn't make any difference. You can't have subconscious love because love is the highest level of being conscious. And so you can't have subconscious love. We're at the free will stage, but I didn't realize that was ever been written or was generally known. I sort of never talked about that because I figure that's something people don't want to hear, very much so.
Yeah, I think probably it's not generally known, but those who know Law of One, they've heard of it. Okay, I think
you'll have to send me this. It sounds like buddies.
Yeah, you'll love it. It's amazing material. Okay, I think we've talked more than half an hour already. So yeah. Anything you want to close this with today, maybe?
Yep, as always, consciously choose love. Leave the arguments, quit the discord, keep out of bad feelings, choose love. Open your heart, choose love.
Wonderful.
And thank you, Sascha.
Thank you, Michael.